regular citizens can do better than government maybe ever can, which is to really actually take the opportunity to have a conversation with your neighbor, to really think about how you might begin to devise solutions on your block, and then use those as an opportunity to have a conversation with your elected official about how do you create the kind of legislation that amplifies what we're doing and where we can move back and forth. This is not going to be solved just by a bunch of smart people being in the right positions.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to GBH. My name is Susan Goldberg. I'm the president and CEO. Tonight, we're here to talk about one of the most important issues of our lifetimes, an issue you couldn't ignore even if you wanted to in the last several months. The summer of 2023 was Earth's hottest since global records began in 1880. The exceptional heat across much of the world exacerbated deadly wildfires in Canada and Hawaii. There were searing heat waves across the globe. To name just one place, Phoenix had 31 straight days of temperatures 110 degrees or higher. And we had extreme weather closer to home, too. Massive rainfall caused historic flooding in Leominster and in Vermont. Tornadoes hit Rhode Island. New England was oppressively humid, and if it wasn't raining, the skies were filled by smoke from those Canadian wildfires. And I could go on. Clearly, our climate is changing, extreme weather events are coming faster and faster, and we have to act. Despite all that, people don't really want to confront climate change. Even though we can see with our own eyes that more birds are no longer migrating south in the winter, getting the public to grapple with the climate crisis is hard. There are a lot of reasons for this, but I think we in the media must bear some of the blame. For too many years, stories about climate were either scientific treatises or so full of doom and gloom that they left you feeling helpless or hopeless or just wanting to run screaming from the room. But there's another approach to telling this story. Without being a Pollyanna and staying true to the difficult facts, we can do a much better job of highlighting the enormous amount of promising work going on around climate change. There is reason for hope, and tonight our exciting and visionary panel is going to explain why. I'm proud to say that for nearly 40 years, GBH has leaned into climate stories through multiple lenses, from science reporting and investigative journalism to children's programming and local and international news. Recent NOVA documentaries called Weathering the Future and Chasing Carbon Zero showcase innovative climate solutions from across the country. GBH News, CAI, our Cape and Islands radio station, our daily international show The World, and our investigative series Frontline all regularly explore how individuals, communities, and institutions are tackling climate change. And we launched GBH's Planet Future Fund to help support all of this important work. Many thanks to those of you who contribute to it. GBH has an important role to play in helping people understand climate change. It's our job to present programs, films, journalism, and events like this one that bring light and not just heat to this topic. We need to highlight not just the list of challenges, the way I did at the beginning of these remarks, but to create storytelling that can inspire us as caretakers of the planet. Our climate stories should always hit 3 marks: on the side of science, on the side of the facts, and on the side of the planet. Tonight's event is presented with support from our friends at the Museum of Science. I also want to thank members of the Beacon Circle and the Champions Circle for your ongoing support and for being here tonight. Now, let's get the program started. I'll turn the podium over to Dan Lothian, the executive producer of our daily international show, The World, produced right here in this building with PRX. Dan?
Thank you, Susan, and good evening. Welcome to an evening of clear and constructive thinking about the future of our region and indeed of our planet. These are central concerns for all of GBH's flagship series. Here at The World from GBH and PRX, we recently relaunched The Big Fix. It's a public radio journalism initiative featuring global solutions to climate change, from greenhouses for small farmers in India to farming techniques in Mexico to the state of the Amazon forest. We cover both the challenges and the possible solutions. Environmental justice is a key focus for much of our reporting. And as we know that climate impacts hit underserved communities especially hard. But there's more. In GBH's new series premiering on Nova next year entitled Sea Change, the Gulf of Maine, we'll explore new efforts to protect our coastal region, including sustainable fishing, farming kelp, and creating marine protected areas. For as we all know, as goes the natural ecosystem, so we go too. There's a profound link between ocean health and human health. So we're privileged tonight to have as our moderator, independent producer and journalist Miles O'Brien, a longtime friend, former colleague at CNN. I respected his work then, and I continue to respect all the great work he's doing now. Welcome, Miles. Miles's Nova documentary, Chasing Carbon Zero, aired last spring, and he has also made films for Nova on Superstorm Sandy and the wildfires in Paradise, California. So we also have a great panel for you. Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, atmospheric scientist and professor at Texas Tech University, and chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, which we thank for partnering with us on this event tonight. Welcome. Mariama White-Hammond, Boston's Chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Space, and a leading voice on environmental justice. And Melissa Hoffer, the first ever cabinet-level climate chief for Massachusetts and the former lead counsel in the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. Welcome to all of you. So we'll have, just by way of kind of keeping track of everything, we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A after the panel. So let's get started. Welcome, Miles. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. The most handsome man in radio, right there. Wouldn't you say? He has a face for television, but he's in radio, for sure. It's great to see you all. Thank you all for coming out. Great crowd here. That's a good sign. So I'm with the chief, and the chief. So is it okay if I don't call you chief? Because it could be a little confusing. Well, let's go on a first name basis. How's that? So I'd like to do a couple of things. I'd like to calibrate the level of concern among our experts here tonight as they look at their various jurisdictions. So Catherine, you're in charge of the world. Melissa, you've got the Bay State. And Miriam, you're going to do the hub of the universe, Boston. But so let's start with you, Catherine. First of all, how's your summer been in Texas?
Unbearably hot. So I live in Texas, and it feels warm to a Canadian anyways. But this past summer, starting in the middle of June, there was just day after day after day, over 100 degrees, that did not break until just a week ago. And so speaking with people in Texas who lived there all their lives, I heard again and again, I've always been here, and summers are always hot, but never like this.
So let's put that into a global context. I think, first of all, I think heat is a killer which we don't pay as much attention to as some of the other climate consequences, whether it's a wildfire or worsened hurricanes, whatever the case may be. But heat's a big deal. But on the list of big worries, as you look globally, what are you most worried about this evening?
What I'm most worried about is not saving the planet. The planet will be orbiting the sun long after we're gone. I'm worried about us. We have built our entire civilization on an assumption that we hardly ever look at, the assumption that climate is stable. So all of our buildings, our roads, our water systems, our food systems, our health systems, our geopolitical boundaries, our economy, everything is built for a planet that doesn't exist anymore. And today, climate is changing faster than any time in human history. We know we're putting 10 times more carbon into the atmosphere every year than as far back as we can go in the history of the Earth and the most extreme changes it's seen. And we know that in the past, climate has changed very quickly before a very few times. You can count them on one hand. And the times when climate has changed that fast, we call them extinctions. So yes, we scientists are very concerned.
We're in the middle of an extinction, aren't we?
A human-caused extinction, which means that we still have the ability to do something about it.
All right, Melissa, let's talk about looking at this problem from the perspective of the state of Massachusetts. And I must say, I'm proud to live in Massachusetts with the first ever cabinet level official in this. Really, let's give that a round of applause. Give ourselves a little credit here. But as important as Massachusetts is, and we all know that, do you feel limitations when it comes to addressing what is, after all, a global problem? How do you, from where you sit, first of all, think about even mitigation? Obviously, adaptation we can talk about a little bit later, but just when you look at the clear and present danger of climate, how much of it do you feel is your how much is mitigation part of your responsibility?
It's a huge part of my responsibility because the role of the Climate Office is to inject climate into the DNA of all the secretariats, because climate change has typically been the purview of state and federal environmental agencies and energy agencies like FERC and EPA, or at the state level, the Department of Environmental Protection and the DPU, for example, the Department of Public Utilities. And that's just too much climate change for those agencies, because we all know that climate change touches on everything. It's a national security issue, it's a transportation issue, it's an issue of health, as we heard at the outset in the opening remarks. It's an issue that is related to every aspect of human life. So that means it's something that has to be shared across the government. And that requires us to work in a very new way, in a way that is de-siloed, in a way that is atypical, in a way that thinks of systems, and in a way that, while we do certainly need specialized understandings, it also requires us to think in some general terms too. Generalists are very helpful when we're trying to think about how to solve these kinds of problems. So when I think about our potential here to work on mitigation, I think the primary issue that comes to mind, Massachusetts has wonderful plans. Many of you know we had a Global Warming Solutions Act passed back in 2008. At that time, it was one of a very tiny handful of similar statutes across the country. We've been a leader. We had the first regulated cap and trade program in our energy system through RGGI. Massachusetts does punch above our weight, to your point, Miles, and even though we are responsible for a relatively small portion of the country's emissions, our models, what we do here, our innovation in policy, like this particular office, it might be the first, but it won't be the last. And that's a real contribution. But the thing I worry about the most is how to pay for it. I think a lot about the need for us to be quantifying the scale of the investment to get to 2020 so that we can match that with funding strategies and a budget so it really happens.
So what are the climate consequences that you're most worried about? We didn't have the Texas summer this past summer. Hopefully that isn't coming our way, but I suppose it's inevitable, right? Are you concerned more about sea level rise? Are you concerned about heat waves? What are the issues that are kind of clear and present in your view?
I think about all those things, and I'm really concerned about how the interaction of those things. So, for example, last summer we had a drought. And you will remember in the beginning of August, we had extremely high temperatures. We hadn't had rainfall for a long period of time. That caused, a die-off of flowers. That has impacts on pollinators. Fast forward to this year, we have a huge amount of rain. So those tree roots are weakened. We have rain events occur. They come with high winds. We lose our trees. The capability of our forests to draw down and hold that carbon is a key issue for us. It's a big part of our clean energy and climate plan, which has 4 pillars: reducing And when I'm talking about decarbonization, that means taking the fossil fuels out of these systems. So decarbonizing our power sector, transportation, housing, and then we're looking at natural working lands help us get to net zero by 2050 by actually drawing down additional carbon. Carbon capture and sequestration is expensive and it's a long way off, but we all have trees right now and they do a really good job of that. So I worry about how all these things together impact our forests. I worry about how they together impact public health, like we saw this summer with the air pollution that came down from the Canadian fires.
So, Mariama, from the perspective of the city of Boston, are there particular climate change issues that concern you most? And let's throw in one more important thing here, that all of these impacts we talk about disproportionately affect people of lesser means.
Yeah, so I think I resonate with both women have lifted up. Those are the things we're looking at, trying to figure out how to pay for them, trying to figure out how to move them on the schedule that we need to. I do think that there are two huge challenges that sort of concern me. The first is that, as was said, we do have the opportunity to turn this around, but I'm also a pastor, and humans, we have amazing ability to rise to the moment, and we have an amazing ability to stick our heads in the sand when we feel like we can't do something. And so I do have a concern that we are not addressing this crisis in a way that feels tangible, touchable, actionable to enough people that they feel like this is something that they can be a part of. It does not work to just relegate all the climate action to folks like us. Like, we're going to do our best, but we really actually need a full mobilization of the entire populace, not just doing things in their own homes, but thinking about how they're having those conversations with their neighbors, and how we're rethinking policy, and how we're having the kind of dialogue that we really need to have. So I think the concern that we won't mobilize to do enough is the first concern. I think the other challenge is that we will build climate action that works for the privileged and then leaves out those people who have done the least to cause this damage. I used to, watch quite a few movies in my time. I'm a little into science fiction, and so, I think you've seen these where the rich people build this big ark and then they sail off and everybody's crying and trying to get their kid on the boat, and they're a little dramatic, but they're not entirely off from sometimes the way that we have reacted to challenging moments. And so I think, how do we activate all of us, tap into the best of who we are, and how do we make sure that we take responsibility for every single one of us? I've been really thankful. I've been in this role, and I've now had 3 different people in the EEA Secretariat. This is our first opportunity to work with a climate chief. And one of the things I think has been exciting is both at the city level and the state level, we have a real clarity that we need to put equity first. That the most powerful, prescient, and worthwhile solutions ask, how do we make sure that this goes first to the communities that are least likely to receive, and then we can trust it will trickle up to the others, right? And so being able to put forward a climate bank, we had been working pretty hard on this, and as soon as the new administration came in, we sort of hit the ground running. We were able to announce this climate bank that is focused on affordable housing. And that's the opposite of what's actually happening now in most of the decarbonization work. Much of it is starting in communities that can afford it, that can figure out how to pay for it, and it's not happening nearly fast enough in communities where people are living with heat waves, and communities where people are really in flood zones and floodplains already. So I think that's what I see us doing, and I see us doing collaboratively, that gets me excited. But there are moments where, as much as I believe in the power of the human spirit, I do get worried that in the face of this overwhelming disaster, we might just turn on each other, and we might just leave out the same folks that always get left out. That's particularly real for me because that's the community that I come from. And I remember being in the Gulf Coast post-Katrina. And that was a turning point for me because I had, before that, the mentality, oh, I'm working on all these other social justice issues. I'll leave that to the people that don't have to deal with education and equity and don't have to deal with issues of mass incarceration, et cetera, et cetera. And then I said, oh, but the young people that go to the most challenged schools, the folks that are locked up, that nobody comes up with an evacuation plan for, those of us who care about those issues actually need to throw our hats into this ring around climate because these are the issues that will potentially be forgotten if our voices are not part of that conversation.
So Mariama, there's an opportunity here to redress some long-standing problems.
Yeah, I mean,
but you could say, maybe opportunity isn't the right word, it's an obligation. I mean, this reset that we hope to go through, this great conversion, done right, could redress a lot of things, but you don't sound like you're very optimistic.
Oh no, I couldn't do this work if I didn't have some level of optimism.
Well, tell me a little more about that.
I mean, I think the reality...
Give me a little optimism. I like the, by the way, trickle up economics, I love.
That was great.
The reverse David Stockman, right?
I don't know if anybody's been following the whole antimatter, whether or not it drops down and drops up.
The anti-gravity room, yes.
Antimatter goes... Anyway, so I think the reality is there's a lot of people in the world for whom the system we have is not working so great to begin with. And we, as humans, I do think there are many places where we've done better, but we have a lot of room for improvement. And my thinking is that it may take something as big and overwhelming as climate change to say, you know what? We literally have to reimagine the world, and we don't got much time to do it. And I say if we're reimagining the world, why would we keep racism in the mix? If we're reimagining the world, why would we continue to be sexist and miss out on the genius of 50% of the population? If we've got to reimagine the world, I say let's go big. And I do think this may be the only crisis that is big enough to inspire people to do and be significantly better than we have ever been. Because basically our option is evolve to be the best version of ourselves or die in a little dinghy together. And I think, you know what? If those are two options, I think I'll go big, and I think a lot of other people will too. And I think that's what young people are demanding.
Yes.
That's where I see so much hope. I think these younger generations are like, don't tell me I have to settle for this is the best we can do. Let's deal with climate and rebuild an economy that's far more just and make sure that everybody has what they need to survive. So I think the enormity of the problem is also maybe the only way that we can rise to the occasion and build something that we will want to tell our grandchildren about, the moment that we realized that we can do better.
All right, Reverend. Say amen, somebody. Say amen.
I'm going to pass the hat.
Yeah.
So, young people. Let's talk about that because she brought that. That's an important point. There's great optimism, of course, they being young, but there's also a lot of climate depression in that group. I mean, we've really handed them a bad sandwich, we'll say. What do you hear? You talk to a lot of young people.
I do.
See them all the time, those bright, shiny faces in your class. What do you hear from them?
Well, around the world, surveys show that 85% of young people are worried about climate change. And the reason why they're worried is exactly what Mariama just described. For the first time at the global scale, we have a challenge that puts the possibility of a better future in serious jeopardy. Up until now, we have had wars, we have had famines, we have had disasters, but at the global scale, we didn't have anything staring us in the eyeballs directly that could actually lead to a future that is much worse than the future we have today. So that is why, like you said, it is time to sink or swim. Climate change and the biodiversity crisis, I would add, they are the hurdles that we must overcome on our way to a better future. And if we do not overcome them, we will not get to that better future. If we don't fix them, they will fix us, so to speak. So young people realize that. And I think sometimes the older you get, the more, but what about, you kind of get. Not everybody. There's some few notable exceptions on that. But in general, if you look at this situation clearly, you understand what matters. What matters is a livable planet. What matters is being able to breathe the air, which couldn't do this summer in many places, being able to drink the water, which many people, even in this country, cannot do, being able to have enough food to eat, which again, people don't have right here in the city as well as around the world, and to have a safe place to live. And add to that a worthwhile purpose to your life. And all of these things are being put in jeopardy. And so young people growing up, looking ahead to the future, focusing on the future, not so much the day-to-day grind, but where am I going to live? What am I going to do? What's that going to look like? They realize the life that they're envisioning is not going to be possible if we don't fix this crisis. So when I ask people, and I often ask people very frequently, how do you feel about climate change? I asked a group of students at Harvard today, how do you feel about climate change? The number one word was concerned. Then there was frustrated and exacerbated. There was angry and sad, paralyzed, depressed. And I said, that is, first of all, a response that I hear from people all over, so you're not alone, number one. And number two, that is a rational response to what we're seeing. When you look at the facts, that is the most rational, logical response to the facts that we're seeing. But we can't stop there. We have to turn that anxiety and that anger into action, because that's the only way that we're going to get to that better future.
All right, Melissa, the government, some might say it's a little late to the game, but we've had, at the federal level, I know you were there in the early days of the Biden administration, at the federal level, we finally have some money for climate, right? It took a long time to get there. And there is money that is changing things in an appreciable way. You could make the argument that it's a little too late, not enough, et cetera. Do you choose to look at it half full and take whatever you can get?
I want to briefly speak to the question of the kids for a minute, and then
Sure.
I'm happy to answer that. I had an opportunity this summer to meet with a couple of physicians from Mass General Hospital who came in to our offices, and they showed us a chart that is emblazoned in my memory, which was, they have a clinical psychiatric practice there, and it was the rate of suicidality, depression, hospitalizations that the adolescents were experiencing. So you would see, if I had it here, it's predictable, you would see that jumps markedly in 2020 when the pandemic starts. But what was surprising about it is it dips a little bit after, but it kind of levels off. So what they were explaining is that they are, some of this continuing high rate of depression and anxiety is still being driven in part by after effects of the pandemic, but there's also an enormous amount of anxiety and depression because of climate change. And I think what Dr. Hayhoe said was really the takeaway that they had as well, which is that this isn't really something to medicalize. Mm-hmm. It's actually exactly the right response to your life support system really just being crushed before your eyes. And they don't feel like adults necessarily have it. They don't necessarily feel like we're going to fix it. And the thing that does seem to help make them feel better is to engage, and to engage in a way where they feel like their actions are going to be having an impact. So that in no small part, and getting to meet youth across the state this year really inspired me and the governor to kick off our Youth Climate Council. We had an unbelievable number of applicants come in for that. We just started our meeting with them this month. And the goal for that really is they are already climate leaders, and they're incredibly organized and sophisticated, and they really understand the issues, and they really understand the interconnection between human vibrancy and human survival and the survival of the natural world. And so giving them a chance to understand a little bit about the workings of government is really important. And I also think it's very important, I'm hoping that we get to bring them into some hearings, that they get to see some of the decision-making process. And I think it's important to have them at the table. So it's a reminder for all of us that these are the folks who are going to be living with the decisions that we make every day. So I just wanted to address that. On the IRA, There's been analysis done. First of all, it's a transformational amount of funding. I think the predecessor was about $90 billion during the Obama administration, during ARA, which has had incredible, phenomenal effect. The price of solar, for example, has come down some 89%, in the course of the past, 15 or so years. So we know it really makes a difference. So it is transformational. It is also, looking at Goldman and McKinsey and RMI and other folks who've done this analysis, probably if you look at the total cost of decarbonization in the country, and then you look at the money that's available through the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, through the IRA, and through the CHIPS Act, it's somewhere between 8 and 30% of the total cost. And the reason why that spread is so big is because the big question mark is how much will those federal dollars actually leverage private sector money? That's the big play with it. And so, what that means is the balance then is somewhere between 70 and 90% of the investment has to be picked up by other actors, private, state, and local governments. So that's what I think about it. I think it is an incredible jump starter. I think it has motivated and gotten people to, like with the climate bank, for example, that climate bank was capitalized with $50 million for state money. Now we will be in a position to go after a portion of the $27 billion that's coming from the Environmental Protection Agency for decarbonization with a specific priority on low-income and affordable housing. So with a bank, like the Connecticut Green Bank was the first green bank in the country. It has a leverage ratio of 7-to-1 right now, which is incredible. Our bank won't start out there. But what it means is for every buck that Connecticut puts in, it's pulling in $7 additional of private investment. And because it's a bank, you get the money back, maybe with a lower interest rate, but you get that money back. So it's different from a grant program. So this concept of leverage is very important for what we're doing right now. And it's a way to get private sector money to the table that might not ordinarily come in for projects in a low income scenario because of questions about creditworthiness or return on investment. So I think it's a very potent fuel to kind of get us going on decarbonization, but it obviously it won't be enough.
So, Mariam, if I open an account in this bank, put $1 in, I get $7 back. Is that how it goes?
Not quite. So it's not going to be a retail bank on the early side.
No, let's talk about buildings. We talk about EVs a lot because it's kind of fun to talk about cars, I guess, but buildings are a big problem. It's a huge percentage in a city like Boston.
70%.
Yeah, New York probably about on par with that.
Yeah.
And it's a hard problem. I just did a whole film on heat pumps, so I'm a huge heat pump lover. But it's not an easy, especially when you talk about things like public housing, going back to your previous points about making sure this rising tide, which doesn't always lift all boats, actually brings everybody along. Where is Boston on decarbonizing buildings?
Yeah. So I think there's two sides to it. So today I sit on the Parks Commission and I was really excited. We had 2 buildings come before us that are both 100% affordable housing buildings and that are both going to hit, one is hitting the specialized municipal stretch code and the other one will be fully electrified. So I do think that there are signals that we've been sending, opportunities that have been created that are moving us forward. And I am heartened by the number of new buildings that are really sort of taking this seriously. Now, there are some that are not, so we need to keep pushing. But in many places, I've been excited to see folks are really trying to push the envelope on the new buildings. Where we have a bigger challenge is decarbonizing our older buildings. And the large majority of buildings that we will have in 2050 are already built right now. And so I think this summer I spent some time in the UK in Bristol, who was one of the first places in the world to declare a climate emergency, and so they've really been looking at what do we have to do to decarbonize. So we do have a emissions policy called BERDO, and that's the building emissions reduction and decarbonization ordinance. It used to be disclosure. So we are asking and demanding of all of the buildings in Boston that are over 20,000 square feet to decarbonize on a 5-year schedule, and their first major schedule is in 2025. Right, so we're working feverishly to get everyone to report, to get everyone to get their data verified, and then to really work with folks to come up with a plan. And the way that we've structured Berto is that there is a fund. First, we really want everyone to decarbonize, but if they don't hit their targets, they do have a way of paying into a fund, and that fund then is distributed to buildings that don't have a natural mechanism to pay for some of the decarbonization. And so again, it's trickling some of the resources from the communities that have done really well and made out in the building boom and real estate boom in Boston, and using it to help some of our other buildings that have not been nearly as resourced. So that is one piece of what we're doing. I think there's another exciting piece to this, which is that because of that policy, we are driving demand for what we call smart building operators, right? Folks who know how to go into those systems and really optimize energy in such a way, because the first thing you want to do is efficiency. Yeah. And I think we say it, but I'm just going to say efficiency, because we're wasting a lot of our energy.
67%.
And we wouldn't have to make new renewable energy if we just didn't use up the energy poorly, right? So smart buildings operations and really using those mechanized systems that really help to make sure we're maximizing the use of what we already have. One of the things that's really exciting to me is that last year we launched a program called PowerCore based on a model that we found in Philadelphia. I went there, I was blown away. I was a youth worker for 14 years, youth pastor, so I know good youth programs, and I know people who are maybe not quite doing all of what they say they're doing. And I was impressed by the work. And so what's been exciting is we launched our program in June of last year. We are now in our 3rd cohort. When this cohort graduates, and if everyone gets through, we will now have, by the end of this cohort, graduated 99 young people in a year and a half, which is pretty amazing. Today I oversee the Parks Department. One of them is working in the Parks Department doing work to make sure that all of our water features are up to date and all of the things that we're doing in terms of adaptation. So we hired our first, made our first offers to PowerCore graduates to work in our urban forestry division. But one of the things that they also trained in, a group of about 10 of them were able to do a program both in PowerCore and then in a partnership with Roxbury Community College, which has built a lab there so that people can learn how to use this technology, both incumbent workers who were already building superintendents and now this new generation of young people. Through that program, they got placed in buildings all across the city. Some of them were at City Hall, some of them were at BXP, some of them were at, I think Dana-Farber had one. We had folks working at the Fed. And what we said is, all of you buildings are telling us you need this workforce in order to do the work of decarbonization that we've asked you to do. So if these young people are successful in these internships, what we want you to do is give them a job. And some of them over the summer have started, it's the first rung in some of these buildings. But these are young people from Dorchester and Roxbury and East Boston that are now becoming part of the climate solutions, following these regulations that we've created, filling these roles that businesses have told us they are having a hard time filling. It's young people that have often been locked out of the prosperity in this city, being at the front line of these climate solutions. So I think, again, that idea of it's not just one piece. We do have that aggressive policy. We thought about how we built equity into that policy. And then when we heard from businesses, we need a workforce that's ready to make it happen, we said, let's make sure that there's a pathway for some of our young people that don't think that they're going to be able to get a job downtown, and definitely not a good paying job, $70,000 starting job, that's going to allow them to raise their family and stay in the city and not be displaced like so many others. So it's really, how do you make sure that all of the pieces come together? Because if we really want to get people mobilized, really, like I can geek out over emissions policies, That's not going to bring people into the streets fighting, right? A small number. But it's when we really think about these quality of life. How do we build new, vibrant communities where people actually can consume less? How do we get people in jobs that allow them to be at the forefront of something that they just felt like they were the recipient of before? That's how we get our young people to move from a place of feeling paralyzed to feeling like there's something that they can do. And I think they're going to blow us all away.
Yes.
I think being a heat pump technician would probably be a great
Don't
career.
worry, we're looking at it. We're looking at it.
Yeah, if they were doing The Graduate today, they'd say heat
So
pumps,
Ben Franklin,
heat pumps, heat pumps.
Ben Franklin Cummings is working on getting young people. Power Core is a 1-year training. Probably can't get people to heat pump technicians in 1 year. But we are working with some of the other
There's a future in this.
universities to look at it.
All right, so Catherine, let's drive towards solutions here a little bit. Because buildings are hard. That's kind of high-hanging fruit. Or medium-hanging fruit? What would you say? All right, so let's talk about, let's start with the fruit that's fallen off the tree and take us up the ladder.
Yes.
On the solutions that are, stuff we can do. Because whenever I talk to scientists like you and we're doing a story, they're like, this is so frustrating. We just pull this off the shelf, this off the shelf, this off the shelf. We just deploy it, we can do this. Pretty much. I mean, there's some hard ones like concrete and steel. But walk us through the easy, medium, and hard solutions that we can think about.
So in terms of solutions, first of all, I want to explain there's 3 categories of solutions. And to understand these categories, I think a swimming pool is the easiest metaphor to use. Imagine the atmosphere as a swimming pool. And we had just the right amount of water in the swimming pool so our toes could just touch the ground. We had just the right amount of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere to keep us the perfect temperature for life. And then we stuck a giant hose in the swimming pool. And then we turned the hose up and up and up every year. Then the first year of the pandemic, we turned it down 7%. And then we turned it right back up again. So the hose are our emissions. And a lot of the solutions that we've been talking about are turning off the hose. So that's where efficiency comes in because it cuts the amount of water coming out the hose. 67% of our energy is wasted. Clean energy replaces the water with something that doesn't come out because it's not producing carbon emissions. Behavioral change, so we don't need as much. Like you were talking about, the structural changes, that also reduces the water coming out of the hose. But the swimming pool has a drain, and the drain is nature. And nature wants to take up that carbon for us. Carbon is not bad. We just have too much of it in the wrong place. So when we invest in protecting, restoring, regenerating ecosystems, and climate-smart agriculture, we can take that carbon out of the atmosphere and put it back into the soil and the trees and ecosystems where we want it. And at the Nature Conservancy, we've calculated that we could take 1/3 of the carbon we produce out of the atmosphere through investing in nature. But there's one more thing we have to do. The level of water in the pool is now so high our toes don't touch the ground. We have to learn how to swim. That's resilience. And the best solutions are the ones that help us turn off the hose and make the drain bigger and learn how to swim. And those are a lot of the solutions you've been talking about that cities are implementing. So I like the tree analogy. I use it myself because there is fruit rotting on the ground these days, people. It's just a matter of picking it up. So efficiency, some types of efficiency are very low-hanging fruit. Very low-hanging. But then when you're taking old buildings and you're really trying to make an old building completely carbon neutral, that's a little bit higher up the chain. Food waste. We waste almost half the food we produce. If it were its own country, in terms of its heat-trapping gas emissions, it would be the 4th biggest in the world. So redoing how we use our food, how we distribute our food in a world where people go hungry to bed every night, including right here in the city, is an enormous way to take action on multiple fronts. You can imagine it, right? You're cutting emissions, and you're also addressing inequities. You're addressing health and nutrition. There's these amazing win-win-win solutions out there. Clean energy. Solar is now the cheapest form of electricity on the planet that humans have ever seen. Battery capability is starting to catch up. So in places, especially where they don't have access to any type of electricity, going in with clean energy now is actually more affordable than any other kind. That's a pretty, it's not on the ground, but you can pick it off a low-hanging branch. Electric vehicles are really starting to tip over in high-income countries, but what about low-income countries? Well, there's startups that are, as we were talking about, taking out the internal combustion engine from a Toyota Camry and putting in a battery. That's sort of medium on the tree. A lot of agricultural solutions are low-hanging as well. By the time we get up to the top, that's where we're talking about the really expensive technology and the niche solutions that take care of the last drops out of the hose. So the last drops out of the hose, that's where we have to engage with topics like direct air capture. Very expensive, but it'll suck that carbon out of the atmosphere if you're willing to put enough money into it. That's where we have to decarbonize the concrete sector, because that is responsible for about 7% of our emissions, and people are working on how to actually put carbon back into it instead of producing it. The high temperature industrial processes, they're developing a way for solar energy to generate 1,000 degrees of heat, which is what you need for some of these processes, these industrial processes. So there's a full tree all the way up, and here's the thing. By the time we've picked up all the fruit on the ground, and we've picked all the fruit on the low-hanging branches, and then we've gotten a step ladder with 2 rungs on it, and we've got all that fruit too. By the time we do that, all of the really smart people working in the highest hanging fruit, they'll have fixed that for us too. They'll have built this ladder all the way to the top of the tree. So do not wait until we have a ladder to the top of the tree. We have so much today that would lead us to a better future. When we see what the solutions are like, the only question I'm left with is, what are we waiting for?
Yes. So are we at the pool or an orchard? I'm a little confused about the metaphor. But
I know, we kind of mixed it
all right,
there.
so what about a pool cover? Geoengineering.
So
you mentioned, direct air capture. But what about doing things like spreading, sulfur in the atmosphere? Doing a man-made volcano, we'll call it.
Yes. So geoengineering is the idea of engineering the entire planet. And we are actually accidentally geoengineering the planet right now.
Yes, we are.
Because we are digging up massive amounts of coal, gas, and oil, burning it, pumping huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, changing the entire climate of the planet. That's not working out so well. So if that isn't working out well, let's just do it again, but better, is what some people say. And here's why geoengineering is so tempting. Because it offers the idea that if we just did this, everything else could stay the same. And to what you were talking about, for people who have comfortable lives, who hold the balance of power and wealth in this world, keeping things the same is exactly what they want. So when I see avid proponents of massive geoengineering schemes, those people are typically people who are quite well off. They're typically people who are close to the power nexus, people who are not people of color. They are not low income. They're sort of, at the top of the pyramid, and they would love to just keep everything the same. So let's go off and do the geoengineering, and then everything can continue business as usual. But here's the challenge. First of all, there's geoengineering and there's geoengineering. You could even say, large-scale tree planting is a form of geoengineering because we are planting the trees to take the carbon out of the atmosphere. But when people use that word, what they're usually talking about is mimicking the effect of a volcanic eruption on the Earth. Now, people often say, I hear this a lot as a climate scientist, but aren't volcanoes responsible for all the warming we're seeing? No. Volcanic eruptions actually produce little particles that, if the eruption's big enough, get all the way up to the stratosphere, and they act like an umbrella, reflecting the sun's energy back to space. So then people say, well, why don't we mimic that? And here's the thing, we could. It is not high tech. We could do it, and there are a number of countries around the world that have the rocket and space technology to do that. But when there's a really big volcanic eruption that blocks some of the sun's energy, what happens? Famines. Impacts on ecosystems because you're not getting as much energy from the sun. All kinds of a host of unintended consequences, like when you take a pill and then there's side effects, then you're taking a pill for those side effects, then you have more side effects, then you're taking a pill, and so on down the road. So we don't have a great track record. And the other thing too is, if you implement a large geoengineering scheme for the entire world, it is like, and now post-COVID we all understand this analogy, it is like giving every human in the world a completely 100% untested vaccine at the same time. That's what it's like. So do I think we should be studying it? Yes, I do, because we want to know what's going to happen. Do I think that we should be looking at, are there ways that we might try it out that would not be invasive, that wouldn't have negative effects, that could be reversible or ended very quickly, that could help as not a silver bullet, but a piece of silver buckshot? Possibly, because if things get really, 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 really bad, we need every piece of silver buckshot we could possibly collect. We'll be beating down the corners and searching under the bed for pieces of silver buckshot if things get really bad. But I know that today we already have, like I said, we have the fruit on the ground, we have the fruit in the low-hanging branches. If we did everything we could, you know what? We could still meet our Paris target. We could, and nature is not the only, but a huge part of that. So again, when we know what we can do, and when we know the amazing benefits it has for people's health, for justice, for equity, for a better future for all of us, for clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, to be surrounded by living in harmony with nature instead of battling against nature, when we know what that world looks like, it's like, why not? Let's go towards that full speed. Let's do everything we can to get there. And then if things are a lot worse than we thought and we need a few extra pieces of silver buckshot, let's look for them then.
All right, Melissa, we haven't talked about wind very much.
No.
I've heard this part of the world called the Saudi Arabia of wind. And living on the Cape, I can attest to that. It's windy. It's windy out there. But I also, some of my neighbors in the Cape are not so happy about the power lines coming ashore. And I wonder if wind, as a practical matter, can be built fast enough for Massachusetts to meet its 2050 goals.
So if the question is, can it be done from an engineering standpoint, the answer is yes, unequivocally. The problem that we're experiencing with the wind now is the fact that after the commencement of the war in Ukraine and with the pandemic and some of the supply chain impacts that we've had, the way those wind, the federal government makes certain areas in the ocean available for wind leasing, and then the state will essentially put out a procurement for the wind. We want this many, megawatts. We put out an RFP for that. And then the folks who are interested in coming in and developing that wind enter into what is effectively a power purchase agreement with one of the utilities. And so that's a contract. There's a certain price to buy that power that's going to come off of the wind farm, and then those developers can go to the banks and get their financing. So those contracts were entered into prior to these supply chain issues and the events in Ukraine and the pandemic, which were largely unforeseeable. So what happened was a couple of the developers came back and said, we can't build this anymore for this price. So you probably read about this in the newspaper. And so what that meant was that they breached their contracts, and then they had to enter into settlement negotiations with the utilities, and those were settled, I think both of those, for somewhere in the range of $40 million or so. So we've just put out another RFP it's our largest RFP ever for wind. And that does introduce some uncertainty in terms of the time frame. So if you're familiar with our own, Massachusetts has a very, very good clean energy and climate plan. We have very specific targets for reductions in each of these areas, and we have a 2030 target. So we might be looking at a scenario where we might not meet that 2030 target if we can't get the wind built quickly enough. The implications of what's happening in Europe are really significant because their energy markets were really impacted by the war. And so, there was a wind rush that happened there too. Mm-hmm. And some of you may know this, but there are only a certain number of ships that large in the world that actually do these kinds of projects. And some of the engineers that we use here are expert from the European markets. So there's a supply chain constraint across many different parameters here. So can we do it? Yes, it can certainly be built in that time. And in fact, Vineyard Wind will come online this year, at least the first portion of it, which is super exciting. And we are, moving ahead to get, Deepwater Port off of Salem. We've got one of the undersea cable companies wants to come and build in the Port of Salem. We have, I think, the largest wind blade testing facility here in Massachusetts. And a lot of these, wind facilities are being built in areas up and down the East Coast where it's bringing a lot of economic development to communities that have needed that for a long time. So New Bedford was a huge recipient of that. So there's a jobs benefit, there's all of this. So to that end, circling back to your prior question, we are waiting for guidance to come out soon from the federal government on the tax credits that will be available. So Treasury and the IRS should have that out. That will give the developers some sense of additional financing that can be used for these projects. So it comes back really to, will there be enough support financially to get these things going on time?
Whenever you talk about wind and interconnectivity to the grid and power transmission lines, it very quickly gets into issues of regulations and permitting and angry neighbors. What are we so hogtied by our regulation that we can't get there fast enough?
Well, let's look a little bit deeper at that too, because who remembers Cape Wind? Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So I was in private practice when Cape Wind was first being contemplated, and I worked on some of the first litigation over just the anemometer for that project. That was just the thing that they wanted to stick out in the ocean and see what the wind speeds were. And at that time, there was money coming in from the fossil fuel industry to support, these astroturf groups that are challenging wind projects, because wind competes, obviously, with fossil fuel. That is happening now. In New Jersey and other places where there is offshore wind that's being proposed there, you may have read about this, a lot of concern drummed up about impacts on whales, and suddenly, lots of people are concerned about that. Actually, the impacts on marine mammals are fairly well studied, and Massachusetts has spent a lot of time looking at these issues, and the federal government has as well. But the fact is that, there's been a certain amount of manipulation of public concern by vested interests who would like to not see these wind projects be built. And so I think you have to look really carefully at that. And in the instance of the cable, this is a time where, when Germany was doing its big energy transition, or, they had a huge public campaign around it to help people understand the importance of this energy transition. We haven't really done something like that here. And so, with those neighbors who are concerned, it's an important beach. I get those emails all the time. I do really think this is a moment when we have to help people break through the myth that there's actually choice, because there isn't. There's no more choice. Right now, we got to get this stuff built, or we're going to be having a unbelievably horrific future. And I just want to really underscore that, because this summer with El Nino, we got a tiny taste of what 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels looks like, and it is not pretty. Just from Storm Daniel, Greece lost 1/4 of its annual agricultural production. We've seen agricultural production fall off on many other countries this year. We have droughts. We have an immense amount of human suffering. By 2050, we're supposed to have over 1 billion climate migrants. We have many climate migrants right now. There are refugees from the flooding in India. There are refugees from the flooding in China. We have people in this country who have now lived through multiple climate-driven weather disasters. So what we are heading for is it's hard to put into words. And so I think having these conversations with each other about weighing these choices, cable, no cable, wind, no wind, it's not a choice anymore. It's not an option. So that's the conversation that we really need to be having with each other. Realistic, hard conversations. Some of the stuff that we did in the past, we just can't do anymore. And I think the vision that you're hearing is really true. It actually could be a lot better, and we need to work together to have those conversations and say how it can be better. And I think the other thing I would just like to say about it as well is in Massachusetts, we haven't done a particularly good job in the past with energy siting. our energy infrastructure tends to be in communities where we've dumped a lot of other undesirable land uses. And so now is the time, as we build out all this solar and we build out all this wind and geothermal and batteries, well, guess what? That stuff needs a lot of other stuff built around it. It needs transformers. It needs substations. The clean energy needs that stuff too. And it's going to go into a bunch of communities where it hasn't gone before, and we all have to kind of get used to that fact. We have a siting commission. Secretary Tepper just signed the executive order for that the other day, or the governor did. And now we're going to start to have a more rational siting plan in this state. We're actually thinking about where should the solar go? Well, it shouldn't go in a forest by and large. You know, where should the wind be going? Where should the batteries be going? Where is the interconnection? How do we solve those problems? And that's going to be really important. And it's also going to mean we're going to do this energy transition differently. So some people who have never had to contend with having an undesirable land use in their community may have one now. And that's part of what we're trying to do too, is distribute the impacts of our energy system equitably because we all benefit from it.
All right. We have some time for questions. I can't imagine you have any questions after this conversation, right? I don't know where the microphones are, though. I see hands. I don't see microphone people. So there's a couple down here. Oh, there we go. Could you raise your hands one more time? Okay, so why don't you come around that way to the gentleman on the edge. So we just have one microphone, is that right? Two. Oh, where's the other one?
Over there.
She was there.
Oh, okay, great. Now I'm getting it. Down here, raise your hand one more time. There you go. Let's start there on the edge. Right there. Thanks. Yep.
Hi. About about.
Can you say your name, where you're from, just so we know?
Larry Klein. I used to produce for Nova, so I made some early films on
famous Larry Klein.
On energy.
Yeah,
and about 8 or 9 years ago, I was in California, and it's too long a story, but the most interesting thing was a company that was putting enormous arrays of solar panels on old factory building flat roof warehouses and generating a staggering amount of electricity that would go back. It was the mega net metering. And I also serendipitously did something in New York where Bloomberg had stiff-armed Con Ed into letting him put a huge array out on some buildings near LaGuardia Airport. And I'm just wondering, what is the issue with the power companies in these cities? Because that seemed to be the problem in doing more. If you look in the air, the Boston, all these cities are full of giant buildings that could be tremendous, and they're strong. You don't have to do a lot of retrofitting for the roofs. And why isn't it more of this?
Mariama, do you want to take that?
So before I was in this role, I was working to put solar on my parents' church. I was serving at the church at that time, because we have legislation that limits the amount. The goal was to put enough solar on the roof to cover all of the church's needs, and then to be able to give people credit, low-income members around the community. And in 2016, in the midst of this project, having already raised the money, we had a solar reform bill that limited the amount that we could do. So I've talked to many legislators. I don't think they all even understood what they fully voted for, and I wonder who wrote it. But nonetheless, we do have rules that make community shared solar very hard to do. And we need to do more to make that easier. This is something I've been advocating on for years. I do know that the administration is trying to do a lot, but I do think I want to say this. There has been a huge inequity in the distribution of these pieces. And cities are the place where that's a real challenge, because I live in a triple-decker, right? Like, everybody doesn't have their own roof. So shared solar on large buildings like this is exactly what we need. And the way that the 2016 solar legislation was written, it restricted the ability to do those things. So I wanted to say, if you live in the suburbs, I would love if we can have more conversations, because sometimes I know people believe in these things, but they do not recognize that their reps
are doing things that make it impossible for us to move some of these things in the city. I loved what you said about solar, about siting. I'm so excited. Brookline is doing amazing work to electrify. And do you know where most of your substation power comes from? Not Brookline. Welcome to Boston. So I think we've got to make sure that if you're fighting to electrify your city, which I'm all for, you should also have your campaign to say, let's put the substation here and not in the environmental justice community right across the way. And if we can do those two things together, we can get some of this out.
I think it's time for a Weston wind farm.
I just want to quick add on to that.
So,
I just want to quick add on.
yeah, go ahead, Catherine. Go.
Melissa, I just want to quick add on to your point. Our Department of Energy Resources has just done, and you can read this, it's available publicly now, but we've just completed a potential of solar study. And it was really remarkable because what that is concluding essentially is that we can achieve our solar goals largely through projects like you're talking about. So there's rooftop and canopy and along highways and agrovoltaics. So we are very excited about that, and we're really committed to ensuring ways that make community solar a real possibility as well.
Yeah.
Catherine, you wanted to say something?
Yeah. So. We often think of these giant solar farms, but the easiest place to put solar is previously cleared land that we're not using for anything else. And you just mentioned one of the best places, along roads, along highways. And so there's an organization called RISE that's working on exactly that. In France, they're looking at making it mandatory to put solar over all the parking spots that they have. And at the Nature Conservancy, we've developed this tool called SiteRight that maps all of the migratory pathways, the endangered species, the valuable agricultural land, all the places you do not want to put wind and solar, but it also has all the wind and solar energy potential, and so it highlights in good colors that you can see where, if you're going to put in wind or solar, not just in the US, but in India, in Eastern Europe. If you're going to put in wind and solar, where do you want to put it? There is plenty of space. We just have to do it the right way.
All right. Question down here, Rosabeth. Oh, yeah. Yep. All right.
We've heard a lot of talk. My name is James Holdstein. I live in Worcester, Massachusetts. And we've heard a lot of talk about solar and wind, and that's all very good. But when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, the one technology, non-fossil fuel technology that can still pump out energy is nuclear. And I'd like to know what the panel thinks about nuclear, because the nuclear technology today is not what it was in 1980 with 3 Mile Island. And does anybody have an opinion about that?
Not an opinion, but some facts. Because I'm all for anything that'll fix this problem. And I should mention that we did not mention geothermal, we did not mention hydro. I'm from Canada, and most of our electricity is actually from hydro, and so our big decarbonization is not in the electricity sector. We mentioned efficiency, which is a huge way to just reduce the amount of energy that we need in the first place. So there is no silver bullet when it comes to climate solutions, but there is a plethora of silver buckshot. Now, in California, as of today, they actually have enough battery storage that's the equivalent of 5 nuclear power plants worth of electricity production that's already in operation, which is phenomenal. Because, I know this is shocking, but they did figure out a few years ago that the sun doesn't shine at night. So the battery technology has been worked on. Now with nuclear, though, they have not stopped. The technology is under development. Now, why have we not had many nuclear power plants in the last 3 decades? Price. They tried to build one, Westinghouse tried to build one in the Carolinas. It got so expensive, it overran its budget by a factor of 10. They paid $9 billion to dig a giant hole in the ground and fill it back up again. So the old technology, like you said, is just not cost effective in today's world. But at Idaho National Labs, over the last few years, they've been working on something they call small modular reactors. They're so small that one of them fits on the back of a truck. And you can assemble as many of them as you want together. And I've actually calculated it, speaking of facts, and if you look at how frequently wind blows, not on the Cape and not in Texas, but anywhere else, and compared to the fact that you can run a nuclear power plant, one of these small modular reactors, 97% of the time, they have the potential to finally get nuclear fission down to the same levelized cost as wind. And so in Utah, they are actually trying out the first modular nuclear reactor plant. Now, of course, we always hear about fusion, and fusion is moving ahead very quickly. It used to always be 30 years away. Now I think it's safe to say it's always 20 years away. When we get there, there's not going to be any nuclear waste associated with that. Nuclear fusion is incredibly safe. But even if we had nuclear fusion today, that wouldn't fix the whole problem, because electricity, decarbonizing electricity, is only part of it. There's industrial processes. There's transportation that can't be fully electrified. There's the whole agricultural system. There's all our deforestation emissions. There is no silver bullet, but there's a lot of silver buckshot. And one of the best resources I really like is Project Drawdown. I don't know if you've seen it or some others have. Project Drawdown is a clearinghouse of climate solutions. And you go there and they have an article on every type of climate solution there is, all the way from smart thermostats and food waste to advanced nuclear fission and fusion and everything in between. And it's just a phenomenal resource to learn a little bit more about the vast plethora of solutions there are and start conversations where you can say, hey, did you know? I read this really interesting thing. Here's what I heard. Did you know that letting Indigenous people manage their own land is a really phenomenal climate solution? Did you know that educating women and girls in low-income countries especially is a great climate solution? Did you know that going shopping 2 or 3 times a week and eating a lot more plants is a great climate solution too, instead of just having a giant freezer you fill up with all this prepackaged food? So when we educate ourselves, we can have these really fun conversations where we're not limiting ourselves to 1 or 2 or 3 solutions, but we're really looking across the whole spectrum and we're engaging every aspect of the discussion. So thank you for bringing that up.
All right, let's get to Rosabeth there. Can we get down to she's been asking for a question. There we go. Yeah.
So first of all, thank you for an incredibly illuminating and with a sense of urgency, still upbeat panel, which is great. Until you just said something about it, Catherine, you haven't talked at all about transportation. And it's a very big issue right here, where we used to have the best public transportation system in America, and now we have, the second worst traffic congestion anywhere. We have bike lanes all over Cambridge now, but they don't connect to Boston. So we have things that are not connected, and we don't know how to get people from one place to another. It's a big justice problem because people can't get to jobs. And it's a big source of emissions after buildings. What are we doing about, or should do, about transportation?
I'm happy to start.
Yeah, Melissa, Mariama.
Yes, in favor. No, you're exactly right, and it's a huge problem for us. It's the fastest growing source of emissions in our particular state. So we think about it in two ways. One is the fact that we need to reduce VMT, and so that's really where transit and good transportation alternatives come in. It's things like additional buses for the RTAs, other kinds of short-haul transportation to support seniors who might be aging in place, looking at rail solutions so that people can get across the state or connect to go to destinations north as well, and then dealing with the MBTA. So the problems with the MBTA right now, I think probably folks know, the MBTA has been going through a number of safety inspections with FTA oversight. We have brought in new teams to manage that process, but the priority right now for the T is to get it safe again, and to ensure that it is reliable again. So that's the main focus right now. And until that's done, I don't really think that, unfortunately, we're in a space to be thinking about expanding T service. Right now, it's all about, making up for some of the historic disinvestment that we've seen in that system, figuring out, some of the managerial strategies to make sure we're staying on the right track, pardon the pun, but also just making sure that we've got a safe and reliable system. That's the number one priority. When the governor came in, we were looking at a significant labor shortage there. We've had almost 1,000 new hires, getting people back on track. I'm doing great, pardon that pun too. So that's really the first focus. But then, and this goes back to when T for Massachusetts was first formed. And advocates were really coming together for the first time who were working on the environmental issues associated with transportation, the environmental justice issues associated with transportation. We do know that over time we have to be expanding that system. So that's the T. And then as far as other modes like walking and biking, some of the federal dollars that are coming in right now, DOT has been very aggressive about going after federal dollars, both for doing things like improving and electrifying the T, but also for doing things like putting charging stations on all the major arteries around. So, ideally, where we will end up is that when you get in your electric vehicle, you will not drive more than 50 miles where you would have the opportunity for another fast charging opportunity. So we've been seeking federal dollars for that to support bike and ped options, but also to support resilience because folks probably know that some of the stations have been flooded, some of the tracks have been flooded. We need to do things to ensure that the infrastructure can withstand the heat that we've been experiencing and anticipating and some of the flooding impacts. So I hope that helps to answer the question, but I agree with you 100%, and it is something that has been a top priority for the governor.
All right, Reverend Mariama, I feel bad. We haven't heard from you in a bit. So I think we're out of time. I'm just going to give you benediction time. Just do it. Just do it. Make us feel better. Words, just give us something. Okay. Give us something.
Well, we started out talking about the reality, which is that many of us feel overwhelmed by this crisis. But I think we also have in each of us a desire to really see this turnaround. I don't think we want to just give up. I think we want to do something. And so I think that we've talked through a lot of different options. And the one thing I want to remind us is that a key piece of this is reweaving community. Because we definitely feel more anxious and overwhelmed when we feel like we're in it by ourselves. And so I think some of what I hope is that you will do something that I'm sure we all try to do, but that regular citizens can do better than government maybe ever can, which is to really actually take the opportunity to have a conversation with your neighbor, to really think about how you might begin to devise solutions on your block and then use those as an opportunity to have a conversation with your elected official about how do you create the kind of legislation that amplifies what we're doing and where we can move back and forth. This is not going to be solved just by a bunch of smart people being in the right positions. We do need that, and I don't think it's an accident that a lot of us are women, which would not have been true 10 years ago. But it really is an all hands on deck moment. And one of the big challenges is that we're all afraid by ourselves in our individual homes, hoping that something's going to happen. And it's really only going to happen when you start talking to your family members, mobilizing your neighbor. It doesn't have to be the solution to the whole crisis, but we need to start acting in ways that give us hope that we can take on more and more, that we can make those connections and we can make it happen. And I do want to say a huge pitch to young people. There is no movement in human history in which young people's activism has not played a central role in turning the tide. I don't think we'd be in this conversation the way we are right now if it wasn't for the activism of young people, particularly over the last 5 years. So if you are under the age of 40, which I guess now still makes you young because now I'm over 40. Keep going, but I think all of us need to start working together to imagine the future that is possible and to feel connected in such a way that we're willing to fight with each other, for the future I think we all deserve.
All right, give it up for the three chiefs. Chief. I would be remiss. We have one more thing. The reason Catherine is here is is it tomorrow or the next day?
Saturday.
She's being inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Congratulations to her. But I just want to say, to your point, what impressive leadership on this stage. Congratulations to y'all. We're so glad you're in your various positions. Thank you for coming.